Hello and good evening to another Monday night Q&A session. We hope we're loud and clear on our Facebook, Twitter and YouTube channels. Joined tonight by my colleague Mark Barnes-Ryder. How are you, Mark?
Yeah, I'm very good, thanks, Sam. Just looking forward to getting my hair cut this week.
Yeah, I've had a few lockdown cuts. I'm sort of one of these ones now. I don't know if I'll ever go back to the hairdressers because they're terrible, aren't they? If they find out you've had your hair cut somewhere else, it's almost like that you've stabbed them in the heart. So yeah, I'm a bit worried about going back. But yeah, how's other things? Good Monday so far?
Not a bad Monday. Yes, yeah, we had plenty of calls coming through as usual, which is always good. And it's even better when we've got enough people to help, get through the calls and help our customers. So that's always good.
Yeah.
Get quite a few calls on TT installations, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's still very busy. We're still getting questions based around EICRs and the backlog that the private rented sector generated. So yeah, still lots of questions coming in via email and via the telephone helpline. So we posted a question on Friday. So we'll just have a quick look at that, the question of the week. So last week, and I think it was still on social media this week, we posted the question: in a submain using 16mm twin and earth cable, is the 6mm earth in the cable large enough to be a circuit protective conductor? So where should we start with this one, Mark?
Well, I think it may be big enough. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But BS7671 allows us to determine the size two different ways. So we can either look at table 54.7 for easy selection. That will err on the side of caution, and that's particularly useful for new installations because it's often unlikely that you will comply with table 54.7 in some cases where there is a reduced size protective conductor when compared to the associated line conductor. So if it doesn't comply with table 54.7, then you need to go back to the Diabatic Equation, and that will tell us the sort of minimum size that we can safely comply with.
Yeah, so it's very true. We'll just flash up that first bit. So the regulations actually tell us that there are two ways of sizing a circuit protective conductor. Spot on, as you said. We can either use selection, or sometimes often referred to as the easier method, but there's a bit of safety factor in that, isn't it? It always comes out quite large. Or the second method is by calculation, which will always give you a smaller size. So if you're looking to reduce cable size, it's perhaps more better to use the calculation method. But yeah, a lot of people seem to be under the misconception that you have to use the table. There's only one method. It's not. As that regulation that we've got on screen says now, there are actually two ways of sizing it: selection or calculation. So if it comes to selection, it's table 54.7, Mark, and and there are really sort of, it's a comparison, isn't it, to the size of the line conductor?
Yeah, when we're looking at selecting the minimum size of circuit protective conductor or protective conductor, you can use it for both, then it's in conjunction with the associated line conductor. So there's 3 rows in the table, and there's 3 columns. So it depends on, for line conductors up to 16 millimeters cross-sectional area, your protective conductor should be the same size. But as we said before, for existing installations, you won't always comply with that requirement.
Yeah.
So the second row down says where you've got a line conductor greater than 16 millimeters but less than 35, then your protective conductor should be 16 millimeters. And then when you go to larger line conductors greater than 35 millimeters, then it's the size of the line conductor divided by half, divided by two, two, if you like, to give you a easy selection, and you know you're going to comply.
Yeah, that's it. So here's one where in our example in the question a week with a 16 mil twin and earth, we wouldn't comply with the table, would we? Because the table would tell us for a 16 mil line conductor we need a 16 mil CPC, and we haven't. We've got a 6 mil. So it doesn't comply with the selection. So then we've got the option, haven't we, of our friend the adiabatic equation. So I hate to do a bit of maths on at 8 o'clock on a Monday night, but it's very useful, isn't it? Because it this is the whole reason why we have smaller size CPCs in our twin and earth cable, because we can use them to comply with the adiabatic equation and still be fully compliant with BS 7671. So
absolutely, yeah.
So just talk us through a little bit about the adiabatic equation. So if we can talk through, we've got, they should be able to see now on the screen, we've got S equals, and then it's a fraction. We've got I squared T square rooted on the top, and we've got K on the bottom. So what are those parameters, I, T and K, Mark?
So your I squared is your fault current squared, so it's times by itself. So if you had a fault current of 400 amps, you would say 400 amps times 400 amps. That's your base figure, and then you would times it by T, which would be your disconnection time. Now, so what I normally recommend is you do the I squared times T first, and then you square that result, and then divide it by your K factor. It's important to remember that you wouldn't necessarily use the maximum permitted disconnection time in that equation. You would work out using the time current charts at the back of BS 7671 for standard devices. You would work out your actual disconnection time given the level of fault current that you've measured previously. It's important that you need to measure your fault current, or be able to calculate it from your ZS reading.
Yeah. Because it's a lot of people do mistakenly use your maximum disconnection times, your 0.4 seconds and your 5 seconds, and quite rightly, as you say, they should be using the actual disconnection time based on the protective device and the value of the fault current. So yeah, we this was a real life question generated on the phone. So the question that came through on the phone, the example was based around, it was a 6 mil CPC in a 16 mil cable, twin and earth cable. Luckily it was being protected by a 50 amp type B protective device, and the measured fault current was 541 amps. So we had a nice healthy fault current, which is good because it means we're going to get a nice quick disconnection time. So this actual example gave us fault current of 541. That would give us an instant disconnection time on a type B 50 amp breaker, because anything over 500 amps would. But we always recommend, don't ever use anything quicker than 0.1, because we allow for some time associated with the mechanical movement of the protective device. So even if we're in that area of immediate disconnection, use a 0.1 time. And then 115 is based on the K factor for the type of CPC. So in this instance, it was the same material as the line conductor. It was a circuit protective conductor incorporated within the twin and earth cable. So our K factor was 115. So in this instance, the formula actually worked out that we could have got away with a 1.5 mil cable. And it's really down to the fact that the CPC just has to be big enough to carry the fault current for the time it takes the protective device to disconnect. So if we've got a very quick disconnection time, that's going to be advantageous. If we've got a very big CPC, so it's going to carry big fault currents, that's advantageous. But what we need is sort of a happy medium between the two. So long as our protective device can carry that fault current just for the time it takes, the circuit protective conductor can carry the fault current just for the time it takes the protective device to disconnect, then we're happy. Then we've met the adiabatic equation.
So yeah, I mean you've got 5 tables, well actually 6 including table 54.7, but your K factor is worked out with any one of those 6 tables on page 197. So page 196 has got the adiabatic equation. The tables where you get the K value from is on the opposite page, page 197, depending on whether the conductor is incorporated in a cable or whether it's external to a cable. That will depend on your K factor. But to work out your level of fault current, you would go to the time current chart for your 60898 breaker at the back if it's a type B. And sometimes you can use the actual little inset table as an easy selection. If you've got a certain level of fault current, you might be able to look across the inset table and say, I've got a 50 amp breaker, I've got 250 amps of fault current, so therefore I know I'm going to get a 0.1 second disconnection time. If it doesn't quite fit inside the inset table, that's where you'd need to actually read the graph. So you would need to follow the bottom of the graph along to the prospective fault current that you've got, and then read up vertically to where the time intersects that line on the curve, basically. I hope I've explained that clear enough. But sometimes, as I say, you can use that inset table, and generally, as Sam says, for a 50 amp breaker, it's worked out quite well that it will actually comply the minimum size, and often you will comply with a 60 amp breaker, but you still have to check because it depends on your level of fault current.
Absolutely. And so that's why it was one of those questions that has that horrible answer, maybe, because it can, as Mark's rightly said, it's so dependent on the protective device characteristics, i.e. how quickly it trips, the fault current, which determines how quickly it trips, and the size of the CPC. It's the relationship between those 3 things that determine whether it's adequate to act as a CPC. We were quite specific. We were only looking at whether it was large enough to be a CPC and not a bonding conductor as well. We might leave that sort of discussion for another day, but hopefully that's cleared that one up, and it is a really useful one to know, especially when we're doing EICRs, when we come across a smaller CPC than line conductor and we've got to make an engineering judgment as to whether it's adequate or not. Okay, sorry, Mark.
Tom, just to add something else. That if it's important for guys and girls to remember that it's good. The adiabatic is good for disconnection times between 0.1 and 5 seconds. So if you've got a much quicker disconnection time, you'll need to go to a different regulation, and that's that 434.5.2. But we can talk about that another time.
Okay, we'll have a look at some of the questions that are coming into the chat. So very, very early on one, we did have, how do we dead test for a borrowed neutral? So thoughts that came to my mind would be our line and neutral conductors for a circuit should be independent of any other line and neutral circuit conductors. So you'd be looking at insulation resistance tests between the two, or because we should have infinite, or you could do continuity, do it the other way around between the two, in which case you should have out of range. So yeah, we'd be looking, take your line and neutral, obviously isolate, safe isolate and disconnect the conductors. from the breaker and the neutral bar, and then you can do a continuity or insulation resistance test from your neutral to all the others in the neutral bar, and likewise from your line to all the other live conductors on the buzz bar, and that way you're checking that they're independent. Any other thoughts you'd have on that, Mark?
I think you've explained it quite well there, Sam. I think the only thing I would add is that it's important that if you suspect that there's a cross connection between sort of one or more circuits, then you do completely disconnect those circuits from the board. All too often we hear about contractors that leave a line conductor connected to the breaker, or they might, leave a neutral. You just need to, get both of those circuits out of the board so that you can carry out a thorough insulation resistance test or a thorough continuity test, and you're not going to be given erroneous results through other circuits, possibly that are connected to a common neutral or common earth bar.
Yeah, I used to get hit with objects when doing R1 R2 checks and put the earth in the breaker to do the check at the other end, and then of course forget that it's there and energize the circuit and wonder why things trip. So yeah, it's always better to do it properly.
I mean, having said that, it is important to remember that if you're insulation resistance testing, that you keep the CPC connected to the neutral bar. We have to do that for safety reasons. So, but for your continuity checks, you can disconnect them completely.
Okay. And yeah, it's good. Somebody's giving the same reply: disconnect all neutrals and do continuity tests between all disconnected cables. So yeah, we agree. That's good. Second question that's come in. Evening, guys. Can you clear this up for us? Do EICRs apply to commercial lettings? Well, I think really that's a two-part question. Yes, commercial lettings should be frequently tested unless there's a preventative maintenance regime within the installation that means periodic maintenance isn't required. So in general, all electrical installations should be periodically tested in order for them to comply with the requirements of electricity at work regs. But I think the question might be, do they come under PRS? No. PRS at the moment is currently just for private rented sector tenancies. So it's landlords in the private rented sector, not social housing, not councils, but private landlords that are renting their properties out. Those are the EICRs that come under the PRS legislation. A commercial installation should be inspected periodically to confirm its electrical safety for continued use. However, the regulations do talk about if you've got a maintenance regime that involves preventative maintenance and frequency checks, then there's no requirement. But those are sort of far and few between. I've only ever come across them on things like very automated 24-hour production plants where they have to have that because they want to keep the production going and don't want to stop at all. So yes, they would need testing, but it doesn't fall under PRS. Common question regarding selectivity: do we have to use the same manufacturer for all breakers, or can we use differing manufacturers, as manufacturers don't usually share info with each other? So what's your thoughts on that, Mark?
I'm not sure I fully understand.
So I think he's saying, can I have mixed manufacturers in the same distribution board and consumer unit?
I mean, ideally, you want to keep the same manufacturer. If we're talking about a new installation, then you want to keep the same manufacturer, because that manufacturer will guarantee their performance in their own enclosure. They won't guarantee their performance in somebody else's enclosure. And the other thing is, if you are, if you've got an issue with sort of energy let through and tripping, nuisance tripping, you want to stick with the data released for the specific manufacturer of device. So I wouldn't use another manufacturer's data against a different manufacturer's device, for example. Even though they're manufactured to the same standard, there will be different tolerances between manufacturers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a regulation, isn't there, in Part 5, which says that we have to follow manufacturer's instructions with regards the selectivity or the coordination, as we used to call it, between the devices in that enclosure. And our experience tells us that manufacturers will only agree to that if you use their products, because they won't have type tested them with a mixture of products. So yeah, it would be non-compliant to mix manufacturers, and it effectively makes you the designer of that enclosure, because now it's not a standard manufacturer's products, because you've mixed and matched. So it puts a lot more onus on you then to be able to demonstrate that everything is compatible, and that it's no less safe than if you had followed the manufacturer's instructions. So yeah, our guidance pretty strong on this one. Always follow the manufacturer's instructions with regards to the components within their defined enclosure. Let's see what else we've got coming in. Yeah, somebody, thank you very kindly, said, Sam, it goes bang when you forget to disconnect the CPC from the MCB. Yes, yes, unfortunately I do know that, and I can still hear being hit on the back of the head with a bit of 2x2 for doing it. So yeah, it's one of those things that I will never forget. Okay, let's have a look. Oh, interesting one that we do get from time to time, Mark. Topic for debate. Somebody's posted, I carried out an EICR this week and discovered a consumer unit fitted upside down. What code would people give this and why? The questioner actually follows on. I did speak to the manufacturer, who confirmed that the board had not been type tested for such installation and recommended a C2. What do you and others think? Yeah, not so much. We don't often hear it being completely upside down, because to me, if they've installed it upside down, that tells me there's enough space to put it in the right way up. But what we do often hear, as I think Mark will back me up, is we do often hear people have mounted them on their side because the orientation of the space that they've got to fit it only allows for it to be on the side. So but yeah, upside down, that's one that we've not had on the helpline, and that would yeah, it would beg a belief as to sort of, well, why didn't they fit it up the right way? I can only assume it's because of the cable entry, the way that the final circuits were wired, and perhaps were too short to go in any other way. I don't know, I'm only guessing. But in principle, yeah, if again, the manufacturer won't have tested it, things that come to my mind would be heat rises, so that the products will be expecting heat to go the other way, and if we turn things up, we might not get that compatibility. So I think, yeah, we would go with the manufacturer on that. If they're telling us that it's potentially dangerous with a C2, then we would have to go with their recommendations. I think if something was in and was installed, you could always do the other thing as well, of sort of visually inspecting, perhaps even thermal imaging when it's on, to see what that tells us. But yeah, go with the manufacturer's instructions on the basis that if they can't confirm that things are going to operate safely and correctly in those conditions, then we can't guarantee that we're going to have things like ADS if our protected devices aren't going to operate. Have you ever heard of it being upside down? I'm sure, like me on the phone, you've had it on its side, but not upside down.
Yeah, no, I've seen the odd one. It's not common, but I think in this instance the manufacturer has confirmed what we say, what our advice, that it hasn't been tested in that orientation. I mean, it would be particularly important where you've got circuits that are, and an installation that's running at a higher load, and then compared to, say, a domestic installation where, you know, the circuits aren't necessarily running at more than sort of 30% of their current capacity. But in a larger installation, I can imagine that becoming a real issue, possibly, and especially where contactors are involved if they're mounted vertically, because they should have spaces between them anyway to ensure sufficient heat dissipation. So, but I think, yeah, you could put a thermal imaging device, couldn't you? You could look at that. That would give you a good indication. But just follow manufacturer's instructions, I think, is the easy thing, and source an alternative product if you haven't got the space.
Yeah. I think when we've been questioned about them on the side, a lot of the manufacturers in that configuration aren't too worried, because they quite often use the same products in three-phase distribution boards where they are mounted at 90 degrees. So quite often on its side isn't an issue, because the manufacturer can refer to testing that's been done with the same products in that orientation. Let's see what else we've got. So yeah, I think someone else is confirming about 90 degrees. One person is saying, can you reposition a plastic consumer unit within a domestic property? Again, a question that we've had before. So if we're considering it on the basis that the plastic consumer unit is still fit for purpose, so in particular still got all the right barrier and enclosure protection, then yes, you could consider removing it or repositioning it. But you know, it would always, when you're doing that, it would be a recommendation to consider upgrading it. But providing it's still fit for purpose, all the equipment inside's not showing any signs of thermal damage, there haven't been any product recalls on the components within, then yeah, you could look to reposition it in much the same way as we could reuse it. We could add a circuit to it if it was existing. You know, there's nothing that says they have to be completely replaced just because they're plastic or combustible. Anything you'd add to that, Mark?
No, not necessarily. I do remember taking a call today actually on that same question, and I said the same thing. As long as it's still fit for purpose, I think you would recommend. I mean, if it isn't fully RCD protected, then you would recommend that it has the additional RCD protection. Give the customer the option, but it's important that if they decline that you record that on your certification and make it clear that you are actually just moving an existing consumer unit. Yeah, because the question I had today was only half the board had RCD protection. You know, it was moving the board, but it was only half protected. So it's important to be clear on the exact work that you're doing, and that you can demonstrate that you've given the customer the option to provide that additional protection.
Yeah, I think it's one of those ones that, you know, we'd always recommend, if you give options that enhance safety and they're declined, record that fact, so that, you know, unfortunately some of the not so nice customers don't have a very long memory, and quite often we're proposing enhancements which are declined, and then there's an incident further down the line which those enhanced protective devices would have prevented, and all of a sudden we get blamed for not telling them. So yeah, it's always worth you know, recording recommendations and options that aren't accepted, just so that at a later date, if there is an issue, you know, you can't be seen as not having discussed it, and the customer doesn't get reminded about declining them. What else have we got coming in? We do have to say thank you, and my colleague that was with me the other week very well reminded me, quite often we don't get the opportunity to go through all your answers on the night, so but we do appreciate them, and it's great that you know, we can see the chat and the help given to each other within the chat room, so that's really good. yeah, please don't feel offended if we don't get round to your question. We're always very limited with time, but we do appreciate people taking the time to ask the questions, and we trawl through the ones that we don't get to try and pick them up in the following weeks. So please do continue to post your questions. I think this is a follow-on one. If the location of a CCU for a landlord supply is located in a meter box with slight water penetration at times, could we install a plastic IP rated consumer unit rather than metal? In principle, yes. If it's suitable for purpose, the regulation that came in for non-combustible consumer units, or consumer units in non-combustible enclosures, was specifically related to domestic household premises. So strictly speaking, non-domestic, we could consider a plastic consumer unit. The same as with everywhere, it has to be fit for purpose. So perhaps if we're looking at heavy industry with forklift trucks and metal flying around, we wouldn't be looking at plastic. But if it was in a safe space, I think you mentioned a public house, was it, or a landlord? So yeah, not really sure what landlord of what kind of premises, but yeah, if it's a domestic installation, so internally, or if it's on the external wall of the domestic, and so therefore could result in fire spread to the internal aspects of the property, then it has to be non-combustible.
I think if it was also, Sam, if it wasn't intended to be operated by ordinary persons, so if it was in a riser cupboard or a landlord's cupboard, which wasn't accessible, ordinary persons weren't expected to go in there, then that could be another tick in your risk assessment box to suggest that it might be suitable.
Yeah, very much so. Okay. Let's have a look at what else we've got coming in. You keep saying RCD, but surely the type of RCD is just as important. Rarely suitable to have a type AC RCD in the average domestic property, immersion heater excluded. Okay, so yeah, not really sure whether that's in response to something we've said or another question within the chat, but yeah, definitely now we're far more aware of DC current being generated by common appliances, and that DC current finding its way back into the installation, and the problem that can cause is saturating the coil of an AC type RCD and preventing it from operating. So one of the things that the 18th did when it was published was highlight the possibility of DC leakage currents preventing AC type RCDs from operating. So yes, now on new installs, on testing of existing installs, there should always be a consideration of that. And that's one thing. I spoke to somebody on the phone the other day about an RCD that wasn't tripping, and one of the things to start to investigate was, well, is there DC current in that circuit? Is there DC current in that installation that's finding its way back to that circuit? So that's one of the things that could prevent an RCD from tripping. So yeah, I think there's much more awareness now of the different types of RCDs, and the fact that there are lots of devices out there that generate DC, and if we've got an accumulative effect of that, if it's getting up around 6 milliamps, then that can cause us problems with our standard RCDs.
Yeah, I mean the regs now mentions 30% acting on any one RCD, doesn't it? So, for a 30 milliamp device, that's 9 milliamps effectively.
And that's across all of the circuits that it's protecting. So, if we go to a typical old style dual RCD board, that could be 6 or 8 circuits. And what we're saying is that the total DC leakage current of those 6 or 8 circuits shouldn't exceed the milliamp rating that will cause us problems. The 9% is general, so that's AC current as well, on the leakage side. Let's have a look again. Time's racing through us, but we'll try and pick one last one up from the chat room. Type C breakers installed in a domestic property, should this be given a C3 code or a recommendation? Well, it's one that we talked about on one of the previous presentations, and Type Cs will have a tighter ZS to achieve because they'll allow you a far greater inrush or startup current before they operate. So long as you can still meet that tighter ZS, then there's no classification code at all. You know, you could use them if you had, I don't know, you might have a little workshop that's got some machinery that involves a high inrush current, where you're instantly tripping the Type B breakers. So there's nothing to tell you that you can't use a Type C in a domestic installation. Would you agree with that, Mark?
I would, absolutely, yeah. I mean, it does boil down to the level of inrush current, and you know, don't forget that even some domestic forms of LED can have a certain amount of inrush. So, you know, you may increasingly be sort of going to Type Cs. Just be aware of that. It depends on the manufacturer. You would need to confirm with the manufacturer, but I have seen it with domestic type LEDs. So, you know, just be aware of that.
Yeah, and so, you know, again, so long as you can meet that tighter ZS, no issues with using them instead of a Type B.
Yeah.
Okay, well, time's beaten us again. Thanks very much for your questions and responses. So thank you, Mark, as well for all your good stuff tonight, and we hope to see you again. There's no wire presentation this week, but there will be one again in the wire series next week, which will be Wednesday the 21st of April. So if you haven't already signed up for that, please go on to our website and sign up for that. And like I say, once again, apologies if we've not got to your question tonight, but keep firing them in, and we will get to them. And thanks very much for your time.